Have you read 2 Corinthians chapter 11? Well, if you have, then maybe you're like me and find it just a little bit confusing, or at least maybe just one of those chapters that it's maybe a little bit difficult to understand. Here in chapter 11, Paul is clearly giving a defense of himself to the Corinthians. But why? And what's going on here? So let's take a look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 5 through 7. Paul says this, "But I do not think that I am in the least inferior to those super apostles. I may not be a trained speaker, but I do have knowledge. We have made this perfectly clear to you in every way. Was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God to you free of charge?" So some of these things just seem normal to us. So why was Paul so defensive about them? Well, so I pulled out my big Bible background commentary to look at this a little bit further, because I thought, there has to be something going on here that I don't quite understand. And so here's what I learned. In this era, the Greeks highly prized skilled speaking, this rhetoric. And so here when Paul says, I'm not a super trained speaker, he's really referring to that skillful rhetoric. And while if you've read Paul, you certainly know he was skilled in language. What he's saying is that even though he's maybe not the best at rhetoric, he does have knowledge. And that is the knowledge of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's worth more. Well, the content of his message is worth more than having skilled rhetoric in the delivery of the message. I think you and I would agree with that, right? And Paul did too. So what else is going on here? So there's this portion where he's like, hey, was it a sin for me to lower myself in order to elevate you by preaching the gospel of God? Well, no, of course not. We don't think anything of that who should charge to preach the gospel of God? And why would that be a sin? And what's the deal with lowering and elevating and this whole thing? Well, we have to remember that status was really, really important in the first century. As a matter of fact, if you had status, you ought not to give it up. And so Paul, by not charging, was actually lowering himself in status, because if you remember, Paul was what we call a tent maker. So he had a job outside of his ministry. And so who is this guy? Craig Keener says teachers were supposed to gain support by either a patron's sponsorship, by charging fees, or even by begging, but never by engaging in a working class job. So here, Paul is actually lowering his status by taking a job. And so these false teachers were sort of shaming Paul for doing that. But Paul says that it was actually to the Corinthians' benefit that he did that. He was supported by other churches. And that's really what Jesus asks us to do anyways. He says that it is better to serve others. He asks us to disregard status, to serve others, and to do what is best for others. And that is exactly what Paul does here for the Corinthians. So how are you serving others? How are you putting others before yourself? And what does it look like for us in this day and age to disregard status for the benefit of the gospel of Jesus Christ?